show. The theme for this week is toads and amphibians. And I'm going to continue on with that and talk about how do we know what type of toads or frogs are in the area? How do you know how many toads or frogs are in an area? And how can you actually go through and take part in the Minnesota DNR state sampling, population sampling? So, first, let's cover some bases on what are some methods of sampling. So we have methods of sampling. When I say methods of sampling, I'm talking about methods of sampling population. And typically, we're trying to get an estimate of how many of a specific species is in a defined area. So one example would be like quadrant sampling. So say you're in a field. Say that this is a big field, and you have purple loosestrife, which is an invasive species to Minnesota, all throughout this field. And you want to know how much purple loosestrife is in that field. Can you see that on the? Okay, cool. But this field is way too large to go through and count every single purple loosestrife. So a way to do it with the limited resources and people is to just take a sample from random samples throughout the area. So like you put a quadrant down here, and then you put a quadrant down here, all the same size, and then you average out how many species you got per how much area that is your quadrant, and apply it to the rest of the field. That's one way. There's also forms of indirect sampling. Indirect sampling, for example, would be like we indirectly sample deer based on their feces that they give off. Someone somewhere figured out that deer defecate roughly 13 times a day, all right, in 24 hours. So if you're surveying your grandma's backyard and you see 24 piles, you could say that maybe within that area there would be 2 deer that spent 24 hours there. Obviously, deer don't stay within within like a super small area. They roam around, possibly from their ranges can be from like 2 miles to 23 miles. So definitely the distance that you're actually measuring a population does come into account. But this is kind of how we measure, take population samples of frogs and toads here in Minnesota. We don't actually go out directly and count every single toad or frog in the lake or river. We actually use an indirect method of calls. We listen for the frog calls and what they sound like, how often are they happening. All plays into the fact of all play into like the equation of how many is in that population, and then based on different calls that they hear, they'll be able to determine how many different species are in that specific area. So another question would be, why would we need to know how many individuals are in a population? Well, because we're always humans have such a large impact on our surroundings, and ecology is always based on balancing an ecosystem. A way that we're able to make sure that we humans or anything else that isn't impacting one species too much is to monitor the population numbers. So if a population had a huge decline right after some specific event, we'd be able to tell, like, oh, hey, the Walmart that we just built is definitely affecting the swamp behind that property. So that's kind of why we measure populations, and especially for the insects, bugs, basically anything, deer population, walleye population. We're always trying to make sure that we're staying in that equilibrium, that balanced environment. Specifically, why do we want to know populations for toads and frogs? Well, these are actually a species indicator. These are indicator species. When I say indicator species, that means these are one of the most sensitive organisms to pollution. So they are very sensitive to pollution due to their porous skin, and pollutions generally are and they're amphibians. So that means that they're living in aquatic environments and on land. So they get a sampling of pollution from the lakes and ponds or rivers, and sampling from the terrestrial area or ground that they actually spend time on. So they are an indicator species, which makes them very important to us to pay attention to, because we want to make sure that we aren't damaging our environment. We want to make sure that we aren't damaging the frog populations. And if the frog populations are going to be affected, that means that further down the line, more species will be eventually affected. So that's just a way that we can get some early detections of pollution and try to be preventative about taking care of our environments. So, like I said, you don't need to actually see the frogs to actually take a population survey. So I'm gonna play some sounds from our native frogs and toads. And this way you can hear for yourself firsthand what to listen for when if you are ever out at night, or want to if this interests you in being a volunteer to take frog surveys. All right, so a lot of those probably sounded very familiar. If you ever spent a night out outside near wetlands or lakes or rivers, you probably were able to say, hey, you know what? I might have heard that before. And that is exactly how people go through and do frog population surveys. And I'll let you know how you can actually partake in taking frog surveys. So if you go onto the DNR website, search frog call and toad calling surveys, they have a program where you can sign up to be a volunteer. And how does it work? You sign up, they give you a few resources, they give you a route or a specific area to go to. They give you maps, they give you identification manuals for different frog calls. And they'll give you a field data sheet, and a field data sheet is basically a checklist of how many different numbers of calls, different species, and all of that stuff. And you're wondering probably how do you go through and just go anywhere and listen to the frogs? Well, from what I see is that they will actually give you a specific loop to do, and you go through these loops 3 times in 3 different like waves. So you got your early spring frogs. You go through that loop 3 times in early spring, which is like April, and then again you'll go through during the summer 3 times that same loop. That's like June and July, and then you have your late summer, and then you go through that 3 times and listen to listen for frogs, check off on your data sheet, and so on. So from what they tell from the DNR, from what they have told us, is that you have a starting point, you listen for 5 minutes, mark your data sheet, and then you walk half a mile down to your next listening point, listen for 5 more minutes, and then you continue that until you have completed your loop. So it's a great way for you or family or kids or anyone to be engaged in outdoor learning experiences, getting families out and kids out into the wild, into the wilderness, to experience population sampling firsthand. And who doesn't like to hear the opera of the night? So if any of that is interesting to you, or that you would like to find out more about, come on down to the Headwaters Science Center. We are open Monday through Saturday, 9:30 to 5, and swing by after lunch on Sunday, 1 o'clock to 5 p.m. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Spencer Potter, and that has been your Toad and Frog Population Survey